Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is our class for Thursday, the 21st, where I wanted to talk about 3 chapters in the textbook: organizing and outlining, which at least in my edition would be chapter 7, beginning and ending speeches, which in my edition would be chapter 8, and wording speeches in my edition would be chapter 9. So I know that you might be using an earlier or later edition, so the chapters might be in a different order, but the content should be pretty similar because you are now working on preparing, hopefully, for your very first speech, your autobiographical speech, which is meant to be a 5-minute speech where you share some information about yourself and your life with the audience. Lots of different ways you could proceed with this speech. You might decide to give a life overview. That happens to be the case, well then obviously you have to condense into 5 minutes the major elements that you wanted to discuss. Perhaps you wanted to focus on a particular time period or a particular element in your life. That you could do. Perhaps you wanted to talk about a specific topic about your life. You oftentimes suggest that someone who isn't comfortable with self-disclosure might want to talk about education. It's the one thing we all share, whether it be your educational history, or it could be your goals for education in the future, or your educational present and why you're in this particular class. So there's lots of different ways to go about this, and actually I'm going to be showing some sample speeches next class where you can see students like yourselves putting forth autobiographical speeches. In no way are these students related to GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you will be used as a case study. But these speeches were uploaded onto YouTube and they are publicly available, so I'm assuming that they are available for us to view and use as models. And we'll talk a little bit about strengths and weaknesses of those speeches. So, in terms of organizing and outlining, I'm hopeful that you've got an idea of what it is that you might be talking about in your speech. The next step is to organize and outline, and I would say that that's perhaps the most important step. When you organize and you outline, it's easier to remember the points. It's easier to present the points because they're easier to remember. It makes you seem more credible because you're more confident, and it also makes you seem more persuasive, as you can see in the notes below. So I'll always include the notes that I would put on a whiteboard, the notes that summarizes these videos below the videos. So you've probably got some experience with organizing and outlining, but the experience you probably have is not something that would be suited for giving a speech. It's probably something that would be better suited for writing a paper. In other words, the more detailed, the better when you're writing a paper. So if you have a very detailed outline, that's a good thing when you translate that over into writing a paper, because then there's less writing you have to do. It's the exact opposite when you're giving a speech, because when you're giving a speech, you want to be able to maintain eye contact with your audience, or in this instance, the camera. So what you want are keywords and phrases. If you are very well prepared, you may not even need to refer to your outline, though you should still have it just in case you happen to lose your track of your points, and then you can refer back to it if necessary. And no one is really going to see your outline except you. That said, in this particular class, I'm asking to see your outline because I wanted to give you, from an academic perspective, my impressions of ways that you could go about improving your outline. I actually use an outline myself in delivering these class videos. Here it is on paper, what you have below the class video printed up electronically. So that literally is an example of my outline of major points and subpoints. Notice that I've got keywords and phrases. I'm not using complete sentences. I don't have too much text. That said, writing an outline is very individual, so you have to find out for yourself what feels the most comfortable in terms of writing an outline, but almost always less is more in terms of the outline. If this feels uncomfortable to you, you can work backwards. You could actually write a paper about yourself. And then what you could do is reduce it to a written outline that you would use, let's say, to help you write a paper. And then you could reduce it to keywords and phrases that you would use when you are basically delivering a speech. Or one way of thinking about it is that your speech is basically a summary of what you wrote your paper about, if you decided you wanted to write a paper about that was autobiographical. And I give the same advice to my writing students. If they feel uncomfortable writing, well, then give a speech about the topic and then write out what you said in that particular speech. And then what you should have is a good outline, or at least the beginnings of an outline. So that's it. A couple of points to consider as you are putting together any kind of argument. You need to have a thesis or a central idea, and you need to have some sort of an organizational plan. Now, everything has an introduction, a body, and conclusion, whether it be a speech or whether it be a paper. And the introduction is when basically you greet your audience if you're giving a speech. That part is important so that we know that it's time to pay attention. This is also where you probably give your thesis and your main point. Your body, or as the Toastmasters video talked about it, the discussion section, this is where you give your evidence, your details. And then the conclusion, this is where you say farewell to your audience, and this is where you give a sense of closure. Outside of that, there is no one good way to organize a speech, just like, excuse me, there is no one good way to organize something like a paper. Chances are you've used all of the techniques that I've listed below in the third section, for instance, such as chronological, organizing your arguments based on time. This works very well if you're teaching somebody how to do something. It's oftentimes organized by time. First this step, then that step, then that step. Or for an autobiographical speech, you might want to talk about it in terms of chronology. You begin at the beginning of your life and then you work your way to the present. But you can also organize things topically by categories. So there could be 3 major points that you wanted to discuss in your paper, or in this instance, in your speech. You could actually even organize those topics based on order of importance, putting the most important first because that's going to be the most persuasive. But the negative of that is that you may lose your audience interest as your arguments become less persuasive. Or the other way around, you save the most persuasive for last. But are you going to be able to hold your audience's attention long enough so you could get to that last point? Or perhaps you want to organize something spatially by description of location. This works very well if you're trying to describe the appearance of something. Or a causal relationship, cause and effect. Sometimes it can be difficult to separate cause and effect. Or some combination thereof. It's not like you have to separate these into separate categories. I oftentimes use the example of a real estate agent trying to sell a piece of real estate, and how they might go about presenting this piece of property differently based on lots of variables. The first being the property itself. The second being the people who are looking at the property and considering buying, or in other words, the audience. And then thirdly, just on the strengths of the real estate agent themselves. So in other words, you might decide to organize your paper or your speech based on, well, the topic, or that would be the piece of property, the audience, and of course, you're thinking about who are you writing for. This is an academic situation, or who you're speaking for. And while you're speaking to your peers, this is in the context of a class or an academic situation. And of course, your own strengths and your own weaknesses, you probably want to capitalize on your strengths. So imagine if, again, this real estate agent were selling this property, and let's say it was a very old piece of property. It might lend itself quite nicely to a chronological argument, that the property was first built in the late 1800s, and then you could go through all of the different owners. In fact, it's on the National Historic Registry. The property might also lend itself very nicely to that organizational pattern if it's a new property, let's say new construction. But a piece of property that's, let's say, 40 years old, it's not new or old, perhaps that might not be the best way to talk about that property from a chronological perspective. Perhaps topical would be better. So there are, let's say, 3 elements you want to consider about the property. You want to consider the price of the property. You want to consider the location of the property. And you also want to consider, let's say, the school districts. Though, of course, you could rank those into order of importance. And order of importance can be subjective. So for one group, it's the price point that's most important. For another group, looking at that property, it's the school district because they happen to have children. So again, it can depend, and you can put the most important first, or you can put the most important last. Or let's say talking about this piece of property spatially, that if you were to enter into the property, immediately over to your left is a living area. Right in front of you is a small staircase that leads to a kitchen. To the right of the kitchen is a small bedroom that could be used as a den. To the left of the kitchen is a dining area. Off of the dining area is a deck. Now, you've never been to this property, but I've described it well enough so that you could get a sense, at least a little bit of it. So, lots of different ways you can organize things. Some suggestions, however, that I do have for you. Audiences, whether they be readers or they be listeners, respond very well to familiarity, that which they know already or are familiar with. It's an old teacher technique. Talk about the old material first and then build upon it. Questions. Audiences tend to get engaged when you ask questions, even rhetorical questions, which is a question that doesn't necessarily assume an answer. The idea behind that is that we probably supply that answer internally within ourselves. So it engages an audience. Or problem and solution. So you present a problem or a difficulty. This works very well for persuasive speeches in particular. And then you offer a solution, or at least a partial solution, or process of elimination. So all of these work in one way or another. Now, that speaking outline that I am going to ask you to submit into me, and I can tell you right now, I know what the temptation is going to be, that you write 2 speaking outlines, one for you and then a different one for me. I want to see the actual speaking outline that you use in real time when you are giving your speech. And again, if you want an example, just look below this video. Key words and phrases. You don't want too much text because you want to be able to look at the camera, not necessarily rely on your outline. And of course, the more you practice, the less likely it is that you would even need to reference your outline. But it's there just in case. I liken it to a trapeze artist. Trapeze artist, a good one, doesn't fall. So in theory, they wouldn't need a net. But it would be silly for a trapeze artist to perform without a net because something could go wrong. Same sort of idea behind the outline. Keywords and phrases. Oftentimes, what speakers will do is include things like stage directions. So if you want to do something like show a visual, note that you aren't required to show an audio or visual for your first speech, but you will be with upcoming speeches, which is something that we'll talk about. That said, you're certainly free to use audio visuals in your first speech if you so wanted to, but not required. I've even had students write down things like breathe. If you think about the last attendance question and how to deal with nerves. And as you can see, I responded to all of your responses. You all gave great suggestions, particularly the breathing suggestion. During times of anxiety, people tend to hold their breath. I remember taking a women's self-defense class years ago, and we were told if we were ever attacked, we should yell out the word no, not necessarily just to draw attention to ourselves. That was secondary. It was so that we could draw air into our lungs at a time when we would need to either fight or flee. In other words, the time when we probably most need oxygen, we would be likely to be holding our breaths or breathing irregularly. That's something that the body naturally does during times of anxiety. So just breathing in deeply from the diaphragm and remembering to breathe. A lot of times students have difficulties, or speakers in general have difficulties with ums and ahs, these filler words. Oftentimes people are using filler words either because they are giving themselves time to think because they don't know what it is they're going to say next because they haven't taken the time to really prepare an outline and a plan. Or this is a way for the body to get oxygen into the lungs. So you're using the ums and the ahs as a way to take in a breath. And you can do that silently. Silently pause and take in that breath rather than using ums and ahs. There's nothing wrong with using an or ah occasionally. But if you're using ums and ahs to the point where your listener, your viewer is thinking they're using a lot of ums and ahs, well, then that's too much. You might want to use note cards for your notes. Some people do for their speaking outline. If you do so, I suggest you number the note cards just so you aren't confused by getting the note cards out of order. I personally like sheets of paper. I suggest that you use some sort of a hard copy rather than relying on a screen. First, if you're reading off of a computer screen, it oftentimes is very observable when you are recording yourself. And secondly, if you have any kind of mechanical failure, you've got some difficulties involved because now you've just lost your notes because you've lost your screen. So I literally have the paper version of what's on our Moodle site in front of me. Now they give you examples of outlines in the textbook. For instance, in my version of the textbook on page 119, there's an outline of drunk driving. That's a great outline for you to get a sense as to what somebody's speech was about, but it's not a good outline in terms of giving you an example of how to write an outline because it's much too detailed. If you were to read that outline, you would get basically the entire speech. So again, it's useful for you to hear or to read about what somebody would have been talking about in a speech, but that's really not practical when you're actually delivering a speech. Again, keywords and phrases. I want to see the actual outline that you use. Don't be tempted to write an outline that is a written paper that you read because it'll sound like you're reading. You want keywords and phrases and to have a level of informality and conversationality with your audience, which means you're not aiming for perfection. There is no such thing as the perfect speech. But what you want to try to do is to make a connection with your audience. That's much more important. And this is not a class in editing. So it's not about splicing together lots of different pieces from different recordings that you've made for the perfect speech. It's the one shot only speech, much like my own videos, one shot. I might begin a video and then realize that I wanted to start over. And certainly you've got the option of doing that. But once you've invested a certain amount of time, well, then it's going to continue. So certainly I know that at this point, unless there were an emergency, I'm not going to stop this video and re-record because I've already got 17 minutes invested into it. So thinking about memory. Now, one of the things that's quite true of listeners, because we want to think about listeners as well as speakers, is that we all have very poor memories, generally speaking. Listeners as well as speakers. From a speaker's perspective, this is a good reason to have an outline. From the listener's perspective, you want to try to make things as clear and as detailed as possible for your listener. How bad are our memories? Bad. Some studies have shown that we can remember plus or minus 7 items, or even plus or minus 3 items. Plus or minus 3 items means 2 or 1. That's pretty small. Now, it's not an exact number, but the idea is that it's a small amount of information. Now, obviously, all of us remember more pieces of information than that because we've utilized techniques. For instance, repetition. The more likely you are to repeat something, the more likely it'll move from short-term memory to long-term memory. Or chunking, which is grouping like items together. We do this with telephone numbers, for instance, where we group numbers into 3 digits for the first 3 numbers of a phone number, and then the last 4 digits of a phone number. Mnemonics, memory techniques, which you may have utilized in past classes, or teachers from your past classes may have utilized some of these techniques. Things like acronyms, which is basically a word, and each letter within the word represents another word, so that ultimately that word represents a phrase. So I think about the acronym that I share in my writing classes, KISS. And each letter in the word KISS represents a word to remember. K is for keep, I is for it, S is, well, simple, and last S could be, I say silly, some people say stupid. Keep it simple, stupid, or keep it simple, silly. I think stupid's a little bit harsh, so I changed that. You probably use acronyms in math classes. science classes, anatomy classes, so that you can remember long, complex pieces of information. So you can provide this to your audience, much like teachers do to students, anything to help them remember. Now, the first speech, they're not going to need to remember content because it's autobiographical. That's done deliberately. And you're not going to need to use outside resources because it's autobiographical. It's based on you. That's done deliberately. But once we get to the informative and the persuasive speech, things become more complex, as we will discuss. And you can utilize many of these memory techniques. So the next chapter, beginning and ending speeches. Now, the entire speech is important, but especially the beginning and the ending of the speech, because of something called the primary recency effect. You can see this in the second section in the notes below, part 1. That in terms of memory, we best remember what we hear and see first and what we hear and see last. So you might want to try this with, let's say, an important event in your life. Take something like vacation. Chances are you remember the beginning and the ending of the vacation better than the middle of the vacation. Well, what this means for writers and what this means for speakers is that you want to put particular attention into your introduction and your conclusion, the first impression and the last impression, if you will, because that's likely what your audience is going to be remembering. Now, there are lots of different ways to put together an introduction and conclusion. Chances are you've written papers in the past and you've tried some of these techniques that I've listed out for you. The good news is that you can mix and match these techniques and you can use them for either intros or conclusions or both. Things like talking about reality works very well for an introduction and or a conclusion. Something that is real and applicable to someone's life is likely to get their attention. Proximity, something that is nearby, is likely to get someone's attention in an introduction or conclusion. Or something that's familiar to the audience, that's likely also to get an audience's attention in the introduction conclusion. So let me give you an example. Every morning I skim the headlines of news articles online, and if it's something related to education, which is familiar to me, it's real to me, and it's part of my real existence, I'm likely to do more than skim, but pay closer attention. If it has to do with higher education, I'm paying closer attention yet still. If it happens to deal with GCC, I'm going to stop and probably read that article, even if it means it's going to make me a little bit late, because it's very real to me. My life is GCC. It's very near to me. GCC is my career, and it's very familiar to me. That said, there are other ways to get audiences' attention, and thinking about news organizations, they oftentimes utilize many of these techniques, such as suspense, what's going to happen next. That's a good way to begin or end a speech or any kind of writing. Conflict. And people find conflict to be suspenseful and interesting. Again, the media takes takes this perhaps to great extremes. Humor. Though humor can be tricky, it oftentimes is very individual. What can be funny to one person may not be funny to another. So you've got to be careful with using humor. Importance. Just saying something is important at the beginning or the ending of an argument gives it a sense that it's probably important, and people are likely to pay more attention. Question and answer. As I was indicating, that people tend to naturally supply answers. So I'll give you a brief anecdote from my own teaching, actually, where I asked a question, a rhetorical question in my Shakespeare class. At this point, we're reading a play you might have some familiarity with, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in this play, you have characters falling in and out of love with one another through magical spells. And it just so happens that the Queen of the Fairies, because there is a fairy world they were introduced to, and she's the epitome of beauty and perfection. She falls in love with, because of a magic spell, not only a human whose name is Bottom, because he's at the bottom of the social scale, he's a laborer. He acts like an ass, for lack of a better word, a bottom. And through magic, he's been literally transformed into a donkey, an ass. And even though we're supposed to suspend disbelief because we're seeing magical spells at work, sometimes it's hard for an audience to understand how could the Queen of Fairies fall in love with this bottom character, this ass. So I ask a rhetorical question, one that I'm not expecting an answer for, to illustrate how Shakespeare's about timeless and universal themes is related to our own contemporary experiences. And my question is, how many of you have ever fallen in love with an ass? And what I expect are a few chuckles or a few nods, and sometimes I get some very active participation with people with hands in the air where they want to respond to that question. And it was meant as a rhetorical question, but it goes to show how when you ask a question, it's very human to try to provide the answer. So this is a good way of getting an audience's attention. Just keep in mind, if you raise a question, you want the answer to be obvious. It's a rhetorical question, or you want to provide the answer at some point or another. Quotation. Quotation is a wonderful way to engage audiences, especially in intros and conclusions. The quote should be relevant to your topic at hand. Lots of different ways to find quotes. You can probably just go online and find quotes, but as you know, going online is a risky endeavor. You want to make sure that you're verifying authenticity. And there is a resource that actually is available online, Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, that I highly recommend. It's organized much like a dictionary, alphabetical order, but in this instance is based on categories. Bartlett's Familiar Quotations is considered to be the definitive source for quotations, much like Webster's Dictionary is perhaps considered the definitive source for dictionaries. So if you wanted to look up a quotation about love, for instance, you would look in the L section of Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, and you would find the word love, and then you would find lots of quotations that are associated with love. Perhaps one of them would be applicable to the argument that you happen to be making. What you might want to do, because I do remember this happening to one of my former students, they literally began the speech with a quote and didn't tell us they were quoting, and it was a rather long quote. Now, of course, with the quote, you want it to be exact, word for word, so obviously they were reading. But what we had assumed was because they began the speech through reading, that the entire speech was going to be read, which is not what you want to do. You want to be conversational. That said, after they finished their quote, they told us that it was a quote, and then they transitioned over to a more transitional mode of delivery. But I had recommended to that student that if they had only began the speech by saying, let me begin with a quote, then we would know that the entire speech would not be something that would be read, that we could expect an ending to that reading, and again, then they would have the conversation with us. Storytelling. People love stories. It's one of the first things kids ask for. Tell me a story, tell me a story. Again, the story should be related to the content. Personal references, and it doesn't just have to be an autobiographical piece. Chances are that you might make reference to yourself and other kinds of instances. For instance, I just made a reference to myself in my class in Shakespeare, even though you could think of this as an informative speech and that I'm trying to give you information, teach you something. A startling statement, and the idea of shocking the audience, but you need to be careful with this. I think I shared with you a colleague of mine at another college who was teaching a public speaking class, and the student was talking about being true to oneself and began to actually disrobe. The argument the student had being that they wanted to show their true selves to the audience. And the teacher hadn't stopped that speech. It looked like the student was actually going to disrobe completely. And might I suggest that's not appropriate considering the situation and the purpose. So that was an example of trying to shock the audience that didn't work. But I can share with you an example of a speech that shocked the audience that did work in one of my classes. Actually, this happened in a face-to-face class, and it was a long class, a 3-hour class. And so we met basically once a week. And it was during the break, because it was such a long class, we had a class break about in the middle. And it was towards the ending of the break, and most people were basically shuffling through their paperwork, much like I was doing, to get ready for the second part of the class. And then all of a sudden, and again, I wasn't really paying attention, I was looking at my notes, but I heard a student begin to choke. And I looked up, and if you've ever heard the expression, time stood still, that's what it felt like to me. And many thoughts were running through my mind at the same time. about the idea of whether or not I can make it to that student in the back of the room in enough time to perform a Heimlich maneuver. Did I remember enough about the Heimlich maneuver to perform it correctly? Should I call 911 first and then try to perform the Heimlich maneuver? Well, I didn't get very far. I just basically was able to step up from my chair before another student intervened and took that choking victim and performed what seemed to be the Heimlich maneuver. And out of the choking victim's mouth popped a rolled ball of paper. It was quite surreal. We're all staring at this rolled ball of paper. And then the person who performed the supposed Heimlich maneuver comes to the front of the class. It turns out they were next to deliver their informative speech, and right after the break. And they announced to us that what we had just witnessed was a simulation of a choking. However, if it had been real, would we have known what to do? And that the topic of their speech that day was the Heimlich maneuver. It was very clever. And yes, something could have gone wrong, but they had planned it all ahead of time. They had a friend in the class who had agreed to pretend to be choking. They had put a rolled ball of paper in their mouth. So when the speaker pretended to perform the Heimlich, then the choking victim could spit out the rolled ball of paper to capture our attention. If someone else had reached that supposed choking victim first, they might have performed the Heimlich, and when performed correctly, could break ribs. So there was some risk involved here. Or let's say the person with the rolled ball of paper who was pretending to choke actually began to choke. And then their friend is not performing the Heimlich because they think it's a simulation. I mean, things could have gone wrong, but it had all been very well planned and executed. It went wonderfully. And now all of a sudden, a topic that could be considered a bit dry, performing the Heimlich maneuver, became quite interesting to everyone in the class because it had specific relevance to all of us, because moments previously we had all been exposed to what we thought had been a choking. And what would we have done? Or forecasting and summarizing is also a great way to begin and end. Telling the audience what you're going to talk about, talking about it, and then reminding the audience what you talked about. This is a technique we oftentimes use in writing. It's oftentimes known as the sandwich technique, for instance, where you've got two pieces of bread. In other words, they use the bread analogy as holding the meat, so to speak, of the speech, of the details and the evidence. But the bread can be seen as introducing the topic and also summarizing the topic. In other words, they hold it all together. The last chapter is about wording, or at least the last chapter I had assigned today is about wording your speech. This one can be a little bit tricky because ultimately you want to make sure that you are being conversational. And it's different than writing out something because you're using simpler vocabulary than you would be if you were writing. You're using shorter sentences than you would be if you were writing. And it's certainly less formal than if you were writing. So again, you don't want to read a paper to the audience. You want to have a conversation. That said, there are some things to consider, especially if you are working on developing your speech skills over the course of a lifetime. Again, we're at the introductory place at this point. But you can use definitions creatively. Usually we talk about the denotation or the dictionary definition of a word. But words also have connotations or associations with them. So two words can have the same dictionary definition, but different connotations. For instance, cheap and frugal. Two words that basically have the same dictionary definition. You don't spend a lot of money, in effect. But have very different connotations. Cheap sounds stingy or negative. And frugal sounds positive, or someone who's very mindful. They both mean not spending a lot of money, but they have different associations with them. Or think about a negative definition, which is a definition of what something is not. Usually we define what something is. That's what dictionaries do. But you can define what something is not. For instance, by wealth, I can say by wealth, I don't mean money. I mean health and happiness. So I've defined what wealth isn't. That wealth is not financial. That wealth is something else. Or a contextual definition, that definitions are understood based on the context in which they are given, the context being the surroundings. So if I were to talk about brief in a writing class or in a public speaking class, I'm probably talking about being concise. However, if I were to talk about brief in a fashion class, I'm probably talking about an article of clothing, a piece of underwear. And if I were talking about a brief in a law class, I'm probably talking about a legal report. So the context, the situation can influence definitions. Advanced techniques. So when you've really become comfortable with public speaking, now you can begin to play with language and begin to use some of the literary techniques that you oftentimes find in pieces of literature. You can use imagery, for instance, which is very sensory and assists with visualization. Think about how advertisements will oftentimes do this, that they will talk about scent or they will talk about flavor. The idea is that obviously you can't smell or taste an advertisement, but after watching or reading an advertisement using this language, well, then you begin to actually feel, let's say, hungry for something because they've talked about the scent and they've talked about the flavor, even though you can't taste it or even though you can't drink it. A metaphor, and technically a metaphor compares two dissimilar things. And it does not use the word like or as. If you're using like or as, that's a simile, comparing two dissimilar things, using like or as. So if you say cold as ice, that this person is cold as ice, that's a simile. If you wanted to say that this person is ice, then that's a metaphor, comparing two things without using like or as. I remember hearing an autobiographical speech once about the person comparing themselves to a color, red. And they said that they were red. They weren't saying they were like red. So this was a metaphor, saying, I am red. And they used many of the associations accompanying the color red, passion and fire and anger, to describe their personality. So it was quite clever. However, as the speech progressed, it became a little bit more difficult to follow because the comparisons they were using weren't quite as obvious. At one point, they were talking about the terminals in a car battery, so it became very confusing how that was related to some common references to red. So if you're using these advanced techniques, you want to make sure that you're using them well. And again, you're not required to use these in the beginning stages of public speaking, but you think about some of the great public speakers of our time. And, individuals who study public speaking and evaluate speeches and rhetoric, they oftentimes will identify speakers such as Martin Luther King or John F. Kennedy as some of the great speakers of our time, in part because they're using things like imagery and metaphor and simile. In fact, more often than not, it's Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, that's listed as perhaps the best speech ever given. But we don't have to aspire to the best. We have to aspire to being competent and then improving over time. Rhyme. When the endings of words sound similar. Oftentimes this is utilized in poetry. Again, it was a technique oftentimes used by Martin Luther King. There's the opposite as well. Alliteration, where not the endings of the word sound similar, the beginnings of the word sound similar. So they all begin with the same consonant sound, for instance. All of this makes language very appealing to the ear. It becomes very musical. When you are thinking about language, you want to be audience-centered. In other words, you are thinking about the needs and the expectations of the audience. I'm not talking about standing in the middle of the audience or being in the center of the audience. In other words, you want to use language that's appropriate for your audience. And you already know your audience, that you're working with adults because we are all in a college class. And that in and of itself means that you can use certain language and you are assuming a certain level of education. You're also assuming a general audience, that no one has any particular expertise in anything, even though individuals in your audience might have expertise. So there might be somebody in the audience who has medical expertise, but that doesn't mean that you should be using medical jargon or medical terminology that would be known throughout the medical community, but not amongst a general audience. Use neutral terms that are culturally sensitive and inclusive whenever you can. So rather than saying something like postman, you could talk about postal carrier. Rather than talking about something like fireman, you could talk about firefighter. His and her pronouns have become particularly complex in our society. If you can put it in the plural, you're generally better off so that you can just say they. I know that now there's a movement that when you are using a plural that perhaps you should just use, or when you're using a singular, perhaps like a he or she, perhaps it's better to just use the plural they across the board. What I tell students is the same in my writing classes and in the same in my public speaking classes. I think intent is very important and trying to be inclusive and sensitive. I can say that I sometimes, especially when speaking, will make an error. Sometimes I might say something like policeman instead of police officer, especially I suspect if I were ever being attacked. Hopefully that never comes to be the case. I would be wanting and asking for a policeman. If I were writing something out, I would be more cautious about it because I would have the time and the wherewithal to be able to say something like police officer. So you want to try your best to be culturally sensitive and culturally inclusive whenever possible. So those are the three things that I really wanted to talk about for this particular class. Notice that most of the textbook readings are really up front, so that you can utilize this information when you are planning speech 1 and speech 2 and finally speech 3. Though your focus now should be on speech 1, which is something that you will be posting onto Moodle, and I'll talk about that further on the 12th of October. And that means that not only will you be posting, but after that date, and I'll talk about this as well, you get to view the speeches of your peers and send me privately strengths and weaknesses of all of those speeches. Because not only do you want to deliver your own speech, but you want to view the speeches of your peers. That's ultimately the best way to improve your public speaking skills. Just like the best way to learn how to write is to read, the best way to learn how to read is to write. The best way to learn how to give a speech is to watch the speeches of others. The best way to really understand how to watch the speeches of others is to give speeches. So it goes back and forth. So what's left is today's attendance question, and that happens to be due on Saturday the 23rd, 48 hours from this video. But again, if you need additional time, please let me know, and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. And it's specifically about speech 1. Now that we've talked a little bit about some of the elements of putting together a speech, and specifically about speech 1, not that we're done talking about the elements of putting together a speech, what do you think your biggest challenge will be delivering speech number 1? And why? Again, no right or wrong answers. You're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn. So what we will continue to do is to follow our course outline next class, where we will put some closure onto talking about some of the elements of delivering speeches, at least for now, and then transition over into talking about the first speech. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.